With that, I am thrilled to introduce to you Dr. Tom Williams, the chair of the Public School Forum's board, and someone who has worn nearly every hat and leadership role in education is so dedicated to our students. Tom?
Good morning, Mary Ann, and thank you for inviting me to bring a few remarks this morning. And I'm delighted as well to see so many people on the call this morning. And I did have a superintendent flashback on a 3:30 cancellation, so it was kind of nice to not have to worry about that. I do want to really express on behalf of our board of directors, as well as our advisory board, our gratitude for each of you being here today and so many of you that engage with us throughout the year. And we are delighted to have you here today. I couldn't help but think this morning as we got ready to get started about what's happening across North Carolina while we're on this Zoom this morning, about how many teacher video lessons and Zoom breakouts are getting ready to happen today, how many parents across North Carolina are accessing their parent portal to check in on their students' work, principals and counselors who are trying to chase down that student who's maybe been offline for 2 or 3 days that they're still trying to get connected with, and not even to think about the magnitude of preparing meals both for in-school as well as for distribution sites. And finally, to our counselors and social workers and support people who are really trying to provide needed support and interventions for students and staff across the state. So there's a lot going on while we're on this video today that's at the core of what the public schools do every day. Certainly the impact of COVID since last March 16th has illustrated how central our education and public education system is to the very fabric of our community, and how much depends on the education system and how much the education system depends on everybody else. Today, we're kind of focused on the current, and equally as important, taking a look at the long-term commitment that we at North Carolina need to make to really make sure that each child in North Carolina has the opportunity for a brighter future. So thank you for letting me bring some greetings, Mary Ann, and I'll throw it back to you.
Thank you so much, Tom. And one theme that continues to emerge is that no one organization or person can do what is needed for our students and schools alone. And we would like to take this moment to thank our forum partners who are dedicated to supporting public education and our students. We would also like to take a moment to thank our very dedicated board of directors, emeritus members, and advisory board members. I cannot speak highly enough for the talent and impact of these board members, as well as their willingness to jump in and do what is needed for the forum and students in education in North Carolina. I'd also want to pause and just thank our public school forum team. They're capable, agile, creative, and passionate, and they make all of this happen with tremendous teamwork. So thank you so much to each and every one of you. Over the past many months, our team and I have had the opportunity to listen and talk to many of you, our students, teachers, principals, district and state leaders, and organizations working in education, and those in our education policy network, supporting education across our state. I'd like to thank each of you who are joining us today for taking this time to engage about critical issues. And we are thrilled to have more educators join us today than ever before. Our goal today is to have an in-depth discussion about top issues and policy recommendations while also interacting through the entire program. Dr. Lauren Fox, our Senior Director of Policy, will lead these discussions with me. We will have the chance to hear from the several talented and dedicated leaders from across our state, and also to share ideas and reflections in the chat through polls and ultimately through our breakout sessions. So please jump in. I believe right now we have a poll that we would like to ask to see which roles are represented across here. So if we could do that right now, you should see that pop up in front of you, and just choose the one that best describes your role. I know that several of you wear many, many hats. All right, can we see those results? All right, so you can see the many different roles that are represented here. I think we have several that may not have had a chance to vote just yet, but it's wonderful to see all of you, and thank you once again for joining us today. Dr. Dudley Flood, and here's a quote from him, lifts up the importance of engaging with and inviting students into our discussions to learn about what they need and how policy can support them. Over the past year, I've had the chance to listen to and talk with many students across our state who get right to the point about what is working and what is not working for them and their peers. Just last week, we heard this again in our Student Voices webinar, in which we talked about culturally responsive curriculum. As we go through today, we want to begin by remembering that students are at the center of all of this, and by ensuring that we are making decisions based upon what our students need, but also thinking about how we support our administrators and educators to support our students. Everything we do to support our students will ultimately help our state in terms of workforce development, the economy, and having an educated citizenry. I also encourage you to take a moment and think of a student, or maybe a couple of students, who motivate you in your work and education each day. We each have these students in mind as we go through. You may want to write down the student's name just to have there as we think about it. As we go through today, imagine how addressing key issues would have helped your student that you have in mind, or will still support your student or others like them in the future. Much of the discussion in education has started to look towards the transition and recovery from COVID-19. And it is encouraging that we can begin to consider policies and resources that should be in place so that educators, schools, and districts can be sure that each student has the academic, social, and emotional learning support they need, especially after this year. However, these discussions also come at a time when school districts across the state continue to operate in hybrid and remote learning settings, and safety for all remains a major concern. Not surprisingly, COVID-19 and the inequities exacerbated by the pandemic are top of mind as we gather here today. We're reminded in a very profound way how COVID-19 has impacted our students, educators, and community. And we're also reminded of the heroic efforts of our educators, schools, and families, many of you all joining us today to support our students every day. Before, during, and post COVID-19, equity is at the core of this work. Central to change is, and always has been, the ability of our communities to thrive, and for our young people to receive a high quality and equitable public education, to ensure that they're prepared for college, career, and engaged citizenship, and that North Carolina continues to have a strong workforce and thriving economy for all. It is really important to note that equitable does not mean equal. Achieving equitable access to high quality education for all requires that every child has what they need to be successful, and that oppressive systems are dismantled and structural inequities are redressed. We can begin this process by working toward the goal of ensuring that all children have equitable access to a sound basic education, as defined in Leandro case and is guaranteed by our state constitution. Equity is at the heart of the forum's policy and programmatic work, and is both the overarching umbrella and the common thread throughout each of our top issues. Interestingly enough, we did not set out to have the top 10 issues this year, but as we worked through the input gathered, research, and longstanding goals for education, we landed here at 10 once again. These issues truly cover early childhood and early literacy all the way through post-secondary attainment, with many critical issues that represent all or parts of the K-12 system. Some have become more prevalent or perhaps even more critical due to COVID-19, like broadband, while others are longstanding issues like teacher and principal recruitment, retention, and diversity, and funding that align with the critical components in the Leandro short-term action plan. We will share each of these briefly, and we encourage you to dive into the report to explore each issue further. There is something different this year. For each of the top issues, we address why it matters and specific policy recommendations, which will seem very familiar. While often recommendations include resources and funding, it's important to remember that the issues themselves represent the areas or investments that are shown to have positive outcomes on students and for students. However, they take resources and funding to make this happen. The focus is always on what students and schools need to change student learning, access, and outcomes. This year, though, we've also added specific, relatively short-term metrics in the tracking progress table at the end of the report. It's on page 18 and 19. Each of these top issues addresses long-term needs, but the tangible metrics with targeted dates provide specific goals for the forum and others to work toward and monitor over the next 2 years. So Lauren, are you ready?
I am.
Okay, here we go. And I promise there will be much interaction as we go through, but we want to share with you these top issues very quickly. Broadband access. Equitable and robust access to broadband, as well as developing learning environments that keep safety at the forefront, continue to be critical issues for schools and families. 192,000 families with students in their homes do not have access to affordable and reliable internet. We've witnessed significant and innovative efforts by school districts, the state, and partners like NCBCE, the Rural Center, DIT, the Friday Institute, and others. We continue to develop solutions that address immediate needs while also developing long-term solutions to these issues that require multi-stakeholder support. Opportunities like the GREAT grant support local communities to build the infrastructure they need to improve broadband access, affordability, and adoption long-term.
Our next issue is focused on teacher and principal recruitment, retention, and diversity. So as most of you I'm sure know, like many states, North Carolina continues to struggle to recruit and retain a high quality, diverse teacher and principal workforce, especially in high poverty schools and districts. We know from research that access to effective teachers and principals and access to educators of color is absolutely critical for student success. Our recommendations this year address critical needs to strengthen and diversify the educator pipeline in North Carolina, including by increasing salaries and reinstating retiree health benefits for teachers, investing in the expansion of effective teacher and principal recruitment and preparation programs, and implementing the recommendations of the DRIVE task force to increase the racial and ethnic diversity of the teacher workforce. That includes investing in and expanding the North Carolina Teaching Fellows Program to HBCUs.
We know that addressing social and emotional learning through effective interventions and programs leads to significant gains in academic outcomes, even years later. This is particularly important given that 6 in 10 individuals have at least one adverse childhood experience, or ACE. And this year has made the importance of SEL even clearer. Schools need the resources for professional learning and programs to address this, and districts across the state need additional funding to meet the recommended number of social workers, counselors, nurses, and psychologists that should be employed in their schools.
Our next issue is focused on inclusive, culturally responsive curriculum and pedagogy. North Carolina's public schools serve a very diverse student population, and it's absolutely critical that our curriculum and pedagogy is inclusive of the different cultural knowledge and understandings that students bring into the classroom. Additionally, our students must be educated on the realities of systemic racism and inequities that exist in this country, because if we do not understand and acknowledge this truth, we cannot address it. Most importantly, our students want to have a more inclusive curriculum, and they're ready and eager to have the difficult but necessary conversations. So I want to draw your attention to the quote on the screen, which is from Kayla Keaton, a student in Wake County Public Schools. And this came from our session last week that the Dudley Flood Center hosted with student voices on culturally responsive pedagogy. So Kayla said that she and her fellow students are ready to have these conversations. They know what's going on in the world, and they're already talking about these topics at the lunch table and with peers. Students want their teachers to make space to bring them together and talk about hard things. So our recommendations this year include the much needed revisions to the state social studies curriculum to include diverse perspectives and accurately address systemic racism and inequity in our past and present. We also believe that curriculum in all subject areas, not only social studies, needs to be made more inclusive. And finally, we must ensure that current and pre-service educators have access to ongoing job-embedded professional learning to ensure that they have the skills to effectively implement this curriculum.
Districts understand their own local needs best, and ensuring that they have the flexibility they need with developing school calendars, expanded learning opportunities, and allocating funding to rethink what our students need in the coming years will be critical. These are not new requests, but we have learned a great deal during the pandemic that demonstrates the potential and need for flexibility to best support students' academic, social, and emotional learning. When we look at our expectations for schools and districts, enabling them to be innovative and creative to meet the needs of all students is necessary. This is another opportunity for policies to support our students and our schools.
Our next issue is assessment and accountability. So as we've said for many years at the forum, the high stakes nature of our current accountability system has led to increased stress and anxiety for students and educators whose job status and pay are sometimes directly tied to students' performance on our assessments. And now, because of COVID-19, we're faced with additional stress over whether and how students can safely sit for their state tests. So our recommendations for lawmakers include both short and long-term actions regarding assessment and accountability. These include federal waivers for state assessments, suspending the A through F school grades for the current school year, and expanding testing windows, among other items. We also hope that this will be the year, we're hopeful, that our state leaders will make permanent changes to the A through F school grading system. As we've said before, the forum would like to see A through F grades eliminated altogether in favor of an accountability system that features multiple, more meaningful and less punitive measures. At a minimum, we'd like to see the current formula changed so that student growth and proficiency are rated equally at 50% each. So as you can see in the chart, which many of you I'm sure have seen before, the current formula, which is based 80% on a one-time proficiency measure, is much more indicative of the percentage of students in a school who are economically disadvantaged than it is of actual student learning.
Another critical issue is after-school programs and expanded learning. And this quality program is so important anytime and especially now during COVID-19. The After School Alliance, which is a national organization based in DC, finds that North Carolina ranks in the top 10 states in the nation when it comes to after-school programs. And overall parent satisfaction ranks North Carolina first out of all 50 states. Yet we also know that unmet demand for these programs is very, very high, especially among low-income families who report cost as a significant barrier. For every child in an after-school program in North Carolina today, 3 more are waiting to get in. And that unmet need is even more stark in rural communities across our state. Investments to expand access to after-school and out-of-school programs are needed. Research shows that these programs have bipartisan support as they promote workforce development, increase community safety, encourage leadership and skill development, and provide greater support for working families, all things that are critical to the success of our local communities and North Carolina.
Next, we have early childhood education and literacy. We know that high quality care and learning environments beginning at birth are absolutely necessary to setting the foundation for success in school and beyond. But according to a recent study, before the pandemic, only about half of all parents were able to access any type of formal early childhood care for their children. Then 6 months into the pandemic, that dropped to less than 1 in 3. Early childhood supports are also key for literacy development in early grades, which we know is necessary for long-term academic success. So our recommendations this year focus on the need to improve and expand access to early childhood education, including by improving childcare subsidy rates, expanding the North Carolina pre-K and Smart Start programs, investing in stronger literacy instruction, and increasing compensation for early childhood educators.
When we look at this continuum from early childhood, we will take you all the way to the other end of post-secondary attainment, yet everything that happens along the way is so critical to achieving this. More and more jobs across all industries are requiring candidates to hold post-secondary credentials or degrees. As of 2018, 1.3 million North Carolina residents held a post-secondary credential or degree. And if we don't change that at all, we will not reach this new goal. So we are making huge steps through the work of My Future NC. The state of North Carolina has set an ambitious goal for 2 million North Carolinians to have a high quality post-secondary credential or degree by 2030. So there are so many things happening right now to make this possible. This will require investments in college and career counseling, flexibility in K-12 calendars to align more closely with dual enrollment, and early college high school options, and also investments in cooperative innovative high schools.
And finally, we end our top education issues this year with a focus on adequate and equitable state funding to support public schools. This comes last in our list this year because the majority of the recommendations that we discussed today require financial investments in order to be realized. So our recommendations this year include providing the resources necessary to support our educators and students during COVID-19, including financial support for remote learning and the necessary supplies and tools to safely return back to full-time in-person instruction when it's safe for all. We also encourage our state leaders to approve a multi-billion-dollar school bond referendum to be placed on an upcoming ballot to fund desperately needed school construction and infrastructure projects. Finally, this is a critical year for our General Assembly to begin to fulfill the constitutional mandate to provide every child with a sound basic education, as ordered in the Leandro case. As you can see on this slide, this is the court's definition of a sound basic education, and I think that we can all agree that this is a very important thing for us to achieve. Taking action on Leandro was our single top education issue last year, and COVID-19 has only exacerbated the already existing inequities and resource disparities that disproportionately disadvantage students of color, English language learners, and low-income students in North Carolina. In the coming session, we look forward to the implementation of the fiscal year 2021 action plan, which was signed by Judge David Lee, as well as any subsequent court orders. The items outlined in the action plan are specific. They're evidence-based investments that will move us closer to ensuring equitable access and improved academic outcomes for students.
So you have our top issues, and I so appreciate the comments in the chat and those of you sharing links and your feedback, and also the note I just saw about how interconnected all of these are, and that is so, so true. As I mentioned to you this year, we will have metrics. And so we hope you'll take a look at pages 18 and 19 of the report. The link has been in the chat, but also after today. The metrics are very specific and time-bound. For almost all areas, they represent a critical step on the way to longer-term goals and efforts. They're not inclusive of all of our recommendations, but they do represent ways for us to more deeply understand progress and how we ensure we are actually doing work that is moving the needle. Addressing each of these and other critical issues requires resources and funding, as Lauren shared. With the appropriate policies and resources, the investments will help with the immediate needs of our schools and district as we begin the recovery from COVID-19. And they'll also support critical areas for long-term efforts to ensure that every child in North Carolina will graduate prepared for college, career, and citizenship. North Carolina is fortunate to have resources available to address the needs of our schools and students, the understanding of what is needed, and the will of education stakeholders and policymakers to enact purposeful and effective policies. We must use this critical point in time to lay the groundwork for accelerating investments and innovations in education for all of our students. We would now love to hear from you, in addition to the comments, on which issues resonate most with you. The good news is we will let you vote for up to 3, so we're not asking you to only choose one. Again, choose the top 2 to 3 issues that are most relevant for you. Obviously, this is anonymous, but it helps us just get a sense of where all of you are in terms of priorities. Wonderful. Let's see if we have our results ready. Okay, there you can see, and honestly not surprising, both from a COVID-19 and equity lens, but also just knowing how critical these issues are. So thank you so much for sharing. At this point, we will transition into our wonderful panels. And I'm so thrilled to have our first panel here with us. We have Senator Kevin Corbin from the North Carolina General Assembly, Dr. Catherine Edmonds, who is just at the end of her term as superintendent of Elizabeth City Pasquotank Public Schools and the incoming deputy superintendent at NCDPI. We have Dr. Scott Elliott, who's the superintendent of Watauga County Schools, and Daniel Scott, a high school educator from Onslow County Schools. So thank you all so much for being with us today. We are thrilled to have you here. And there we can see all of our panelists, I believe. I may need to scroll over here to see them. There they are. Thank you. Thank you so much for being here. So we have a lot to cover and not as much time as we want. And so we're going to dive right in with each of you and ask, as we look ahead to the legislative session and knowing that we're coming close to a full year of schools adapting to the realities of COVID-19, would you each share briefly about yourself and your perspective and what you see as the key issues that we need to consider in the upcoming months? And I will actually start with Senator Corbin, if that's okay with you.
Thank you for having me. Can you hear me?
We can.
Okay, thank you, Mary Ann, for having me on this wonderful panel, and I appreciate everyone that's joined today. As we move forward, obviously, I guess I'll state the obvious. The thing we need to do is first recognize the difficulty that COVID-19 has brought to all of us, educators, parents, and especially our children. I talk to my superintendents and teachers in my district all the time, and we talk about ways we can move beyond this and recognize the fact that our students have been shortchanged with education. We've done the best we can, but moving forward, what we do as a legislature, we discussed yesterday briefly, we're going to allocate another $30 million for the great grants for broadband. We're going to do that very quickly. We're going to be allocating some more money to go through DHHS for testing, vaccinations, those kind of things to help with that. So I think we just need to do everything we can do to move past where we are, first recognize the difficulty we've had, and then move as quickly as we can to get past it and get back to some kind of normal life for our students, teachers, and parents.
Thank you so much, Senator Corbin. Dr. Edmonds.
Good morning, Mary Ann. And again, thank you for allowing us time on the panel. And I have to give this disclaimer that I'm currently working as a superintendent in a school district and will transition to a new role on February the 1st as Deputy State Superintendent for the Office of Equity. So I'll be speaking from both of those lenses today. And as Senator Corbin has said, we know that COVID has brought many challenges and changes to education as we once knew it. And, we hear a lot that people say, we want to go back to what was normal. But what we have to remember is that normal was not good for all students in our state. And so I don't want us to let the pandemic be in vain and we not take on to some of these innovative pieces that we've learned through the pandemic. But as I look at the challenges and I started thinking about the question, and I said, we definitely need to look at teacher and principal pipeline work. We know that through COVID, there have been retirements, but pre-COVID, we know that we were not getting the numbers of students into our schools of education. So we were already looking at a shortage, and now layer on top of that, the COVID piece, and knowing that we need teachers and strong leaders in our schools as we move forward to be able to help our students academically and social and emotionally to get back to where we want them to be or where they need to be. So having that effective leader and those effective teachers in the classroom, and I appreciate what Senator Corbin said about not impacting or losing our teachers. And so holding districts harmless for the ADM so that we would not have to lose that staff, because it's going to take more staff to get this work done as we move forward. And I know you've heard Superintendent Truitt, State Superintendent Truitt, talk about literacy. And we know that if students are not reading by 3rd grade, that the chances of them graduating for high school it becomes very low for our non-readers. And I think the research says that, in fact, that they're 4 times more likely not to graduate from high school. So addressing early learning is something that we definitely need to look at as we move forward. And I know we have others on the panel, and there are other things that we need to address, talking about the Leandro piece and the tenets of Leandro. And the top tenets are having an effective principal in leading every school and an effective teacher in every classroom. So as we look at moving forward, and how do we get our students back academically where they need to be, looking at that teacher pipeline work, principal pipeline work, and early learning are my top priorities, but also looking at that A through F piece. And I'm going to stop there because I know we have additional time, but thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Edmonds. You're all raising such critical issues. Dr. Elliott.
Well, good morning, Dr. Wolf, and thank you to the forum for this important conversation. Thank you to all of the guests and the other panelists here today. And I promise that I did not cheat by looking, by just copying from the forum's priorities this morning, but you're going to hear a lot of those same issues repeated in my comments. I am Scott Elliott. I'm in my 7th year as the superintendent of Watauga County Schools up here in Boone. I'm glad to see some other of our colleagues getting a little bit of snow today across the state. I'm in my 25th year as a proud public school educator, and just a little bit of a context for you. I know that all of our school systems are operating differently right now, but just so that you understand the perspective of my comments, our school system in Northwest North Carolina has started the year in Plan C, all remote, in August, but we started the year prioritizing in-person instruction for our students with disabilities, our pre-K students, and students served in our school-based mental health day treatment programs. They've been coming every day since August, and we moved everyone else into Plan B back in October, and that's where we have been operating since in that hybrid model. Our greatest challenge right now is not the spread of virus in our schools. It's actually keeping our schools operating by having enough healthy staff able to come to school, not in isolations or not sick every day. I think that we have a lot of issues. You've already addressed some of them. Senator Corbin mentioned several of them. Catherine mentioned several of them. So just a few that we need to look at beyond just the impact of the current epidemic. I think our priority needs to be on staying focused on returning our schools and our teachers to in-person instruction full-time as soon as it's safe to do so. That means right now we need to prioritize vaccinations for our staff as soon as possible in order for them to be able to have the additional protection that they need and that they deserve in order to be able to come to work safely. As has been mentioned, the pandemic has cast a bright light on many of the inequities that exist in our communities, not just in our schools. Those include, as you said, areas like broadband internet access, access to food, and access to mental health services for our students, our families, and even for our staff members and teachers who are struggling right now. I also think, as Dr. Edmonds said, we have a golden opportunity right now to rethink the purpose of our testing and accountability program for it to be a true tool for teachers in the instructional process. We also need to think about how we recruit and retain professionals with everything from that initial licensure process to adequate compensation models. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Elliott, and I'm appreciating that many of us are thinking in the same way and already hearing this morning. Mr. Scott, we're thrilled to have you join us as well from Onslow.
Thank you so much. And I'm so excited to be here. And I think something that's really exciting as well is that I'm excited to be a part of this panel because I'm able to offer a different perspective. You know, I'm actually sitting in my office right now and students are coming in about an hour. So there's some really great perspective that I have as a teacher who's currently, you know, doing the pandemic. And in Onslow County, we've been in school since August, in-person hybrid with B. It's interesting because Dr. Edmonds actually kind of took the point that I was trying to make. I think my biggest fear, and I think the biggest issue that we could have in North Carolina is the thought that we must go back, you know, as opposed to moving forward. I heard a saying the other day that you must always be like a shark in your efforts, which means like if a shark stops moving, they die. And so we must always promote moving forward in everything that we do and in every situation that we have. And so being a shark of education is giving more transparency, I feel, as educators in the classroom. I think that right now there's an indefinite amount of ideas of what might happen in the future. But what we're seeing all over my timeline on social media is students and educators who are feeling lost, who are feeling completely dejected. And have no understanding of what's coming next. And that's actually, there's a specific psychology aspect of that, which is called anticipatory grief. And what that grief type is the anticipation of what might happen. And so my students, myself, all of my colleagues are feeling that anticipatory grief of, we can look forward to these things, however, they'll probably just get canceled either way. And so when you think of the theory of motivation and drive, it has three components: autonomy, mastery, and purpose. Right now, none of our students or our colleagues have a complete purpose of what we're looking for and accomplishing in North Carolina by the end of the school year. I think what could really help us is for transparency of how vaccines are going to be administered to our teachers and our family members. I think a transparency of where funds are going to be allocated, what the summer plans look like. Are there going to be outreach for programs of students? Are there going to be outreach of teachers? Teacher support, what does that look like? What is the percentage that we're trying to get to be able to open up our extracurricular activities? Right now, they're just saying, not yet, not right now, later, later, later. And so then that anticipatory grief gets bigger and bigger and bigger. That time to the motivation, the drive gets less and less and less. And so what we need is a more transparent experience as teachers who are in the classroom right now. So I look forward to speaking about some of the other issues that we have going on across the state, but I feel like that is the biggest one, is the idea that we're going to go back as opposed to move forward, the lack of transparency that exists with COVID-19 and with the problems that happen in the state.
Well, thanks to each of you, not only for sharing your own perspectives, but also highlighting such critical issues as we go forward. And Mr. Scott, I'd love to go right back to you actually and go a little further around social and emotional learning and trauma-informed practices, which we knew we were working towards previously, but COVID-19 has obviously made us even more aware about how that affects learning and mental health. How would you approach these issues as we go forward, like a shark?
Right. So I want to start with just some data points. 16%, or is the fourth leading cause of mental health of global burden of disease and injury in ages 10 to 19 years old. 51.5 million adults in our country live with mental illness. 50% of mental health issues begin before the age of 14, meaning that 50% of our students are gaining mental health issues before they even step into a high school classroom. Anxiety is the 9th leading cause of behavioral and mental disability in all of our students that we see every single day. The thing that's interesting about all of those facts is that they happened before 2019. All of the data points are pre-2019. So when you think anxiety and mental health and social and emotional issues were already an epidemic in our country before COVID-19. And so when you look at what COVID-19 has done for the isolation, for the lack of anticipation, for the lack of experiences for our students, I'm going to start with a story. I have a student, his name's Josh, and that student was really, really big into music. I'm a band director. Great guitar player, was really looking forward to going to college to study jazz. And we got to this school year. He started out just great, had a great junior year. He'd made some regional organizations and some regional experiences. Got to senior year, was going to school, but was a little different. His story led from being set on going to UNCG as a jazz guitarist to no longer showing up to school, no longer having the drive to even go to university, and then ended up dropping out of high school his first semester of his senior year. But then I spoke with Josh and he said, hey, Mr. Scott, is jazz band, is it coming back? Is there an idea of that coming back? And I said, I'm going to do everything in my power to make sure you guys have an experience of jazz in the spring. And he said, okay, if jazz is coming back, so am I. And so now in the spring semester, Josh is back, he has a plan of action, and he's doing a great job. But what we're forgetting is that many times the academic portion of school is not what students are actually looking forward to. If I was going through high school and the only thing I had was going to class 2 days a week and then going home and having nothing else to do, I would not be sitting where I am right now. the other things, the more that school offers, not just the social interaction, but the experiences for our students that are outside the academic realm. That's where I would put my focus. In addition to that, we have to recognize that we can do everything we can for our students, but we have to do even more for the adults in the building. Teachers are going through this experience that's like no other. We are having to be innovative in survival mode. That is the most difficult thing in my 5 years that I have ever done, and I hope that I ever have to do. But being in survival mode and then also being asked to be innovative at the same time, it's very difficult. So the support level that we have to add for teachers, taking away the punitive measures of all of the academic subjects that have those core tests that happen across the state. We must allow for our schools to start to focus on our students and our staff, mind, body, but most importantly, soul. We have to focus on what we can do to build the human capital of North Carolina teachers. And I think we focus that with allowing more freedom for conversation. 76% of a poll of high school students said that they wish that their administrators would offer more time for students to just talk and interact with each other than to be in academic settings. Are schools having the ability to do that across North Carolina, especially with us keeping the state punitive standards for testing? Are we giving our schools the opportunity to just talk to our students, to just have a conversation with them? Every single person is experiencing trauma, and the way that you get through that is giving your trauma a purpose and giving it a way to move forward like a shark through that process. And so that's just a few of the ideas that I have with mental health, but we must start with the human capital, and we must take away these punitive standards so that our students and our teachers could be more free in the classroom to have conversations, to talk, to be human beings.
Well, and I so appreciate how you shared, first of all, the very poignant story about your student and other students, but also referencing our teachers. And right now, I'd love to talk a little bit more with Dr. Elliott and Senator Corbin, because we are hearing a lot about teacher working conditions and what it is like this year for teachers, but also these longer term goals that Dr. Edmonds and others referenced around recruitment and retention. So I wonder, Dr. Elliott, how can legislators and state and district leaders help to address these issues? And Senator Corbin, we'd love to hear from you after Dr. Elliott.
Great, thank you. And thank you to Mr. Scott for those great comments. So yeah, the recruitment and retention of teachers in our profession really always has been and will continue to be a great concern, and is an area in need of attention. I would say now it's more critical than ever before. There's no doubt that this year has been an incredibly difficult year for our teachers. My wife, Laura, is an 8th grade science teacher. We talk about it every day and the ways in which pivoting in the classroom and just supporting our students is so difficult, and how it wears on our teachers every day. And that's regardless of the setting that teachers are in, remote, face-to-face, or blended instruction. It's hard. We still have many bright and talented young adults who are very purpose-driven and who want to make a difference through teaching. And we have a lot of mid-career adults out there in other professions who have great experiences and they have great skills, and they want to transfer that into a career in education. So we must, all of us as a society, as a state, we must get back to giving the teaching profession the respect and the support that it really deserves. I think that begins with increasing the pipeline by removing barriers to the licensure process, like reducing the number and the cost of those teacher candidate tests that everyone must take now. And making those teacher licenses portable across state lines so that it is easier to recruit teachers without those extra tests and licensure requirements. Of course, it also means compensating our teachers and continuing to reward them for their expertise and their experience. And we can do that by doing things like reinstating longevity pay, fully restoring master's pay, restoring the health benefits to our retirees, and creating some new career advancement opportunities for teachers without necessarily having to go into administration, roles like coaching and mentoring, instructional leadership, things like that. And I will say the financial burden for teacher compensation cannot continue to be shifted to local counties and school systems through increased local supplements in order to be competitive with other states. That's an issue that we have to address at a statewide level. But teachers will stay in schools. They will stay in our profession when they're respected, when they're heard, and most of all, when they feel effective. Teacher efficacy comes from having the tools and resources to do the job, and it comes from having respect from elected officials, local leaders, school administrators, parents, and it all comes from, I think, knowing that they're making a difference.
Thank you so much, Dr. Elliott, for what you do every day, but also for sharing these very actionable ideas. Senator Corbin, I know this is an area that you care a lot about too.
Yes, ma'am. Let me just say, Scott Elliott, good point. The advantage of going second on a question, you can always just say, hey, I agree with the first guy. So all the points you made were super valid. And by the way, I love Boone. I'm a product of Appalachian State University, so I love coming to Boone. Hope to come see you sometime. Yeah, I would agree with everything he said. Speaking as a former school board member, I spent, as you know, Mary Ann, I spent 20 years, 5 terms. For some crazy reason, I decided to stay on the school board. But I'm a huge supporter of public schools and our teachers. The obvious, let's talk about teacher pay. Every year I've been in the legislature, I have voted for an increase in teacher pay. I will do it again. That's a critical issue. We've had some early discussions with the governor, and I think we're very hopeful that we're going to be able to pass a budget that the governor will sign. And we've had some early discussions that looks like that's going to happen, and that I think will include teacher pay increase. One thing I know I've mentioned to you before, I mentioned on the TV show on WRAL the other day, is the way we compensate teachers or set those up for districts. Right now, for every 18 third graders, for example, we fund 1 teacher. Well, I've got a school in my district, Highland School. It's a K-12 school. They literally have about 20 students in kindergarten, 1st grade, 2nd grade, and 3rd grade. So with those 20 students, you can't have over 18, so you have to divide that into 2 classrooms. But guess what? The state only funds 1 teacher to that school system. So Dr. Elliott was talking about local supplements. One thing the state could do to help provide more money locally is to pick up the cost of those teachers. I know in my home county of Macon, and I'm guessing Chris Baldwin may want to correct me, but I believe we're paying for about 30 teachers locally. Well, that amounts to thousands of dollars that that school system could use for supplements, could use for a lot of other things. And I think the model has always been, at least in my tenure, for the counties to pick up the brick and mortar and the state to cover the cost of personnel. And the state's not quite doing that, especially for rural, and I'm gonna speak up for rural school systems. It's a little tougher in my area, Dr. Elliott's area, and Dr. Scott's area as well. When you have these rural schools that kids don't come in lots of 18, and I've preached that since I've been in the legislature. So I hope we make some progress toward actually funding what superintendents need for personnel.
Well, thank you so much. And I know another concern as we look forward is just where students are in their academic learning. And you've all made comments of that. We know there's been tremendous efforts. We know there have been gains in different ways, but we also know that it has not been equitable for all of our students. And we've all faced a lot of different challenges as the issues mentioned. I wonder, Dr. Edmonds and then Mr. Scott, if you could share more about how we should be supporting our students as we come out of the pandemic, and how would you recommend expanding the learning opportunities for students? Dr. Edmonds?
Sure, thanks, Mary Ann. And I'm going to go back to Mr. Scott and what he said in his teacher voice that was amazing. As we're thinking about the learning opportunities for students, we have to remember, as Senator Corbin has said, in our rural areas and all areas, one size does not fit all. So having that flexibility to do what's best in your area. For example, in our rural community in Northeast North Carolina, we're looking at learning pods. So how do we partner with our community so that we can have these learning pods so that students can have access to some support throughout the school day? And looking at summer learning opportunities, being able to have programs in the summer that will meet the needs of our students. but also, and we didn't talk about this piece about the flexibilities, but flexibility around the calendar so that we can have an earlier start, so that we can provide those professional growth opportunities for our staff, for our teachers, for our principals, but also being able to bring our students in earlier so that we can start providing some support for them. Because part of the work that we have to do is understanding where are the gaps, where are our students? And then once we have that data, then how do we provide accelerated learning opportunities to get them quickly back up to speed? And so I think in whatever we do, we have to make sure that we can, one, have that baseline, but two, look at those accelerated opportunities and having that flexibility to be able to get that work done.
Thank you so much. Mr. Scott?
Once again, I'm on the exact same wavelength as Dr. Edmonds, 100%. And it was really interesting. I'm glad she brought up the word gap, because there's actually something that I've been researching recently about the idea of an achievement gap. And I've been seeing that kind of cycling around. And I really believe that we in education should deconstruct what the achievement gap is. So that's the bell. Kids are coming in. Sorry. Really feel that we should deconstruct what the achievement gap actually is, because there's a book called Bad Stats that actually speaks about how we have utilized statistics and comparable data in the past to actually continue to keep marginalized students down and to continue to show how they are not I guess, as educated. And we also know that the book that Randall Robertson made, The Mismeasure of the Man, he stated that IQ tests were known as an idea to continue the idea of supremacy amongst our country. And one of the things that I really feel that we should start with when we're talking about the gaps is that they're not achievement gaps, but they are opportunity gaps. Because we must first understand that there are students in our state who have not had the same type of experience through COVID-19 as many other students in our rural communities, our minority communities, our communities that don't have broadband access. I was standing in the office one day and a student walked in. It was the second day of school, and his parent walked in and said, "Hey, I'm disenrolling him." And I was like, "Wow, that's really interesting." And what it was that the student wasn't able to do the hybrid learning the way that the parents wanted, so they just took him out and put him in private school.
Yeah.
There are many of our students that don't have that opportunity or that ability to just go to private school that was fully in person and able to figure out how to test their students and to get their students all in school. So we must start with, who are we comparing our students against in public education? Who are we comparing them against? The people who were not in a pandemic last year? You know, when we think of the comparative statistics of saying that our students are starting to get this achievement gap, there's no achievement gap with any person in the entire United States or the entire world. So we must start with breaking down that achievement gap idea and start making it an opportunity gap idea. The students who haven't had the same opportunities as others during the pandemic, we must fill those gaps and ensure that our students are getting that experience that they need to be successful. In addition to that, when you think of the idea of achievement gaps, and we keep telling our students of color that you are lesser than the students who are achieving higher than you, our female students, that you are lesser in math and science than our male students. We keep saying things like that, and we must understand that we gain our self-concept not from what I think about myself, or not from even what anyone on this panel thinks about me, but what I think that you think about me. So if we continue telling our students that you are not enough, you are not achieving enough, you are not going high enough, they're going to start believing those ideas and their dreams start being a matter of perspective. Their dreams start being limiting. So we must open up that idea. Our students aren't being compared against anyone. We must give them what they want. Ask them, where's your goal? Where do you want to go in the future, you know? And then once we do that, we can then provide them the opportunities to get them where they want to go.
Thank you so much. And we really have about 1 minute left. I warned all of you that time was going to be what we didn't have enough of, but I would love to give everyone a chance to give their advice to legislators and education leaders. So it's 30-second advice. And I would love to start, Senator Corbin, with you.
Absolutely. Let me just say to Daniel Scott, I appreciate our folks that work in the arts so very much. You know, so many times we look at those programs as extracurricular, or they are so important, and we need to make sure those will continue to be funded. So I really believe in what you do. There are a lot of kids that stay in school because they want to be in the band, or they want to sing in the chorus, or they want to be in that art program, and because of that they get the other things. Yeah, moving forward very quickly, no matter time. We've got to continue to address the broadband issue. That is so important. That's number one in especially our rural areas, because of some of this inequity. When kids don't have access to broadband, it really makes it difficult for the parents, the kids, the teachers, and everyone, and especially in my region, and I know in the eastern part of the state, there's so many areas that are underserved, and so I'm going to continue to push in the legislature for additional funding for broadband and for education, period. So just thank you for having me on. I've got to run. I've got another meeting at 9 o'clock now. So thank you for having me. God bless. And thank you for the other panelists. I've enjoyed being with you guys.
Thank you. Well, I know the hundreds of people joining us are appreciating it very much too, Senator Corbin. Dr. Edmonds, your final advice.
My final advice is to remember that behind all the numbers that we talk about, there are student faces. And as Mr. Scott has shared, that as we're looking at support for teachers and staff, to remember that social emotional piece and the anxiety that is out there, and how that transparency piece will benefit everyone as we're looking at ensuring that we have a strong principal leading every school and a strong teacher in every classroom. We have to remember that we have to support them to be strong, and that it's okay if you do have that anxiety. You know, we are there to support you. So that would be my piece of advice across the board, is to be kind and have gracious space.
Thank you so much, Dr. Edmonds. We all need that, don't we? And it's a good reminder. Dr. Elliott, your final advice.
Well, thank you, Dr. Wolf, and the forum again for having us this morning and for letting me be here with these other great educators. Sorry, we didn't get to talk about testing and assessments and accountability this morning. And I know there may be some discussion of that later on. I would encourage everyone to go to the NCASA website and also to take a look, if you haven't, at the white paper that was written by school superintendents this year on suggestions for reforms to testing and accountability. They're very much in line with the forum's views, but want everyone to know that superintendents are working very hard on this issue. Some advice would be, in addition to all of the things that Catherine just said, in terms of public policy, I would just ask that we all continue to look forward, and that we also be a little bit wary of those who might want to be opportunistic about what's going on right now as a way to use the current situation as part of an agenda to move away from public schools. We must defend our public schools, and to remind everyone, I think a silver lining of this pandemic has been that, as I often say, our school systems and our communities are kind of ecosystems. They're interconnected, they're interdependent, especially here in our rural communities. And I hope that the last 10 months have been a reminder to everyone about the importance of our public schools in our communities. I would ask our legislators, our state board members, and others to take kind of a systems view of how we support students, families, and educators. The other things that I've mentioned earlier, you know, not just in public schools, helping our public health partners, supporting our mental health service providers, and in short, we need those vaccines for our staff. So I just want to say thank you to everyone for continuing to be a champion and advocating for our public schools. This really is one of the last remaining institutions that preserve and promote our democracy, and it's worth fighting for. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Elliott. And I appreciate all your innovation, but also just your very grounded advice for all of us. It's so important. And Mr. Scott, you get the last 30 seconds advice for us today.
So I think the first thing, I'll start with I think this could be the last time that I have a chance to speak to a larger audience. So I just want to start out with just saying that every single person who is tuned in today, I could be preaching to the choir, but silence is complicity. And, you know, when Dr. King wrote his letters from Birmingham, that was one of his key points, was that it's not just the people who are starkly against public education who are the issue, but also the people who are in the room with those people and aren't saying anything to them. We must be the educator diplomats, as my good friend Freebird McKinney says all the time, is that we must be the people who change. And in any space, it only takes one person to speak up and say, no, 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 this is not right. We must focus on the students. And there is a saying that I have been going around the entire state and screaming to the rooftops, which is Kasirian and Guerra. And that is a Maasai tribe who are warriors, but their traditional greeting is Kasirian and Guerra. And what it stands for is, how are the children? In every decision that we make as educators, as teachers, as principals, as superintendents, as state board members, anything, we must always focus on how the children are doing and feeding their body, mind, and soul in every action and every decision that we do. So thank you so much today.
And that is the perfect way to end this panel, to have the four of you on here who care so deeply about our children, our teachers, and all of the families and community here in North Carolina. Thank you so much. I promise we will invite back each of you for something else. So this will not be the last time we get to hear from any of you, because you all have so much to offer and we love hearing about your work. So thank you. And with that, I am going to very quickly turn this over to Lauren Fox. If you can believe it, after this panel, we have 4 more amazing leaders from North Carolina. We are so blessed in the state. So thank you all. And Lauren, I will turn it over to you, and thank you for the gift of time that you gave us.
Thank you, Marianne, and thanks to all of our panelists. We have 4 more amazing panelists here today to discuss equity and North Carolina education policy. So thank you all so much for joining us and for bearing with us on time. We will have to dig a little bit into our breakout time, because we really want to hear from all of you. So today we have Dr. Anthony Graham, who is Provost at Winston-Salem State University and also the chair of the Governor's Drive Task Force with us. We have Representative Ricky Hurtado, who is one of our newest members of the North Carolina General Assembly, representing Alamance County. We have Maggie Murphy, who's a Regional Teacher of the Year from Allegheny County Schools, and Reagan Razon, who's a senior at Enloe High School in Wake County. So I'm so grateful to be with all of you today. Thank you so much for joining us. So I want to start with a question for all of you. As we've talked about, this year has exacerbated already existing inequities in our education system, in the community, and the state overall. So as we look ahead to the year before us, please share briefly about yourself and your perspective and what you think the key issues that the state and district leaders, as well as others in the field of education, will need to consider this year to address these inequities. So I'll start with Representative Hurtado.
Hi, good morning, everyone. It's good to see you, Lauren, and the rest of the panelists here. I'm Representative Hurtado. I am a new member here in the General Assembly in District 63, like Lauren mentioned. I think first of all, let me say, I was almost considering yielding my time to Mr. Daniel Scott, because he was incredible. So I don't know if I have much more to add to what he was sharing, but I think entering this year, entering the session, and just entering as another human trying to survive the multiple crises we're facing as a state and as a nation, there's a few things that are on top of mind. And I think for me, it's to make clear that we have to operate with an urgency of now. And what I mean by that is that recognize that we are at a crossroads of multiple crises, a public health crisis that we're still navigating in this global health pandemic, a racial justice crisis that has really elevated the conscience of a nation, as well as a constitutional crisis in North Carolina, where we have learned that we have not been meeting our constitutional duty as a state to meet the sound basic educational needs of every child in North Carolina. And so I think it's important to understand that all 3 of these are interconnected, and they are not a coincidence that those that continue to see the worst educational, health, or economic outcomes all tend to be in the same groups, where they're talking about historically marginalized groups or low income and working families. I think this is a call to action for all of us to make sure that we are taking every step we can in 2021 to work towards recovery and progress.
Thank you so much. I love that. You summed it up so well. And I know you all have your work cut out for you in the General Assembly. So we're so glad you're joining us. Ms. Razon, let's go to the student perspective.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Reagan Razon, and I am a senior from Wake County. Currently, I am an executive at large of the Wake County Black Student Coalition, which is a student-run platform that aims to end the systemic racism that infiltrates our education system. I find that while navigating this global pandemic and virtual school, it's important to me that state leaders and district leaders put an emphasis on listening to the youth when addressing, inequities in our school system. As I've met with different leaders from Wake County, Durham County, and across the states, I've never been disappointed with what has been brought to the table. So I think that by providing students this platform, whether it be in individual schools or district-wide, and letting them engage in these conversations about decision-making, ultimately our school systems will strengthen and the bonds between administrators and students will strengthen. So that's what I want to talk about today.
Absolutely. Thank you so much. We're so glad you're here with us today. Ms. Murphy.
Hi, Lauren. Thank you so much for having me today. And Reagan, I'm so glad to have you here. That was beautiful. And my fellow panelists, I'm so glad to be on this panel with you. Today, I think all of these points that are being made are exactly where we need to head. And I think that if you put all of these people together in a room, we could just solve it all. We could just get it done, right? So I think these raising voices like Reagan's and having educators like my friend Daniel, I think talking about these issues is important, but I'm ready to jump in and solve them and start getting to work on each of these and how we can move forward in North Carolina together with this common vision that we have.
Awesome. Thank you so much. And last but not least, Dr. Graham.
Hey, good morning, Lauren, and good morning, everyone. Thank you for having me. Thank you for allowing me to join this phenomenal panel. Reagan, I am so impressed. There's nowhere in the world I would have your poise when I was in the 12th grade. So thank you for being here this morning. In a very global way, I think the issue that resonates most with me is while we've been busy at work, where we've been toiling away on a daily basis, our schools have resegregated racially and economically right underneath our noses. Since 1996 to now, the number of segregated schools in the United States has doubled. And what we're seeing is what we call in educational research, double segregation, where low-income students and students of color are consistently concentrated in a subset of schools. And then those schools are systematically and significantly under-resourced and underfunded. So we segregate them racially, and then we hit them with a double whammy by segregating them economically. Then we add injury to insult by using a grading system where we affix a scarlet letter to an underfunded, under-resourced school and publicly shame them for their underperformance, when in fact we haven't been bold or courageous enough to give them the financial support that they need. So in that double segregated environment, we also know that there are gaps in access and gaps in opportunity. You heard Mr. Scott talk about this earlier. We know in some of these schools that rigorous curriculum isn't an option. Advanced placement isn't present. International baccalaureate isn't an option. Courses like chemistry, physics, algebra 2 may not be an option. So how are these students then becoming college ready? The sad reality of this situation is our schools should be a place where we're teaching our students about equity and how to share power and resources to create a society that's just and equitable. Instead, we're teaching our students in the very design of our public schools about segregation, about inequities, and about oppression, and how to create and maintain a system that disenfranchises people through policy and budgetary appropriations. This is and will always be, from my vantage point, the greatest educational equity issue that we must address in the state of North Carolina and in the United States of America.
Wow, you said so much in such a short amount of time. That was really amazing. Thank you for bringing up the issue of segregation. I think this is something that many of us fear will become even worse after COVID, and that North Carolina has been a leader in school desegregation in the past, and we've really gone backwards. So I agree. I think that's very important for us to prioritize moving forward. So let's move on to another topic that all of you, I believe, are passionate about: teacher diversity. We know that teacher diversity is very important for all of our students, and especially for our students of color, but our teacher workforce is not representative of our student population in North Carolina. So what steps do you think that our states and districts should take to improve recruitment and retention of teachers of color? And I will start with our Drive Task Force Chair, Dr. Graham.
Yes, thank you. As many of you know, I am the chair of the Drive Task Force. If you're unfamiliar with the Drive Task Force, DRIVE is an acronym that stands for Developing a Representative and Inclusive Vision for Education. Governor Cooper commissioned this group back in December of 2019 to really study and investigate the issue of how do we go about diversifying the teacher workforce in the state of North Carolina. So working with 34 members, diverse group of individuals, professionals who have been fantastic to work with during a pandemic, having all of our meetings virtually. And we were charged with composing a report, getting a plan to the governor by January 1 of this year. And we did so. We articulated 10 recommendations and 46 strategies, short-term, midterm, long-term, that we believe will help diversify the teacher workforce. And if you haven't seen that plan, it's available, it's accessible on the Hunt Institute's website. So given all of that, let me highlight a couple of things that are in the report or in our plan. From a recruitment standpoint, we really need our good friends at the General Assembly to invest dollars and resources in providing scholarships, loan forgiveness initiatives, and tuition reimbursement opportunities that would help alleviate financial barriers for all teachers, yes, but particularly for students and candidates of color. We know based on loan default rates that so many of our alumni or our students of color who've graduated from our universities tend to default at a higher rate. So if we can put in place initiatives that will allow our students of color to pursue a degree or certification in the teaching profession and do so without having financial burden and barrier be a mitigating factor, then that would be an ideal scenario. Secondly, we talk a great deal about the Teaching Fellows Program, and a lot of people put a lot of faith in the Teaching Fellows Program. I like the Teaching Fellows Program, but we have to also accept the reality that the Teaching Fellows Program has historically perpetuated the number of white teachers whom we produce for our K-12 classrooms. So we have to think differently about the Teaching Fellows Program. We don't have the Teaching Fellows Program in its current configuration housed at any of our historically Black colleges and universities. That's problematic. We also have to think about the individuals who graduate from our Teaching Fellows Program. In many ways, these are our best and brightest new teachers, but we don't ask them to serve our state by teaching in low-income schools, in rural schools, or in urban schools. So we allow the best and brightest of our new teachers to go to the best and brightest of our schools, and our state is not benefiting in terms of our students who are in underfunded, under-resourced schools. So we have to make sure that we stop advantaging the advantaged and disadvantaging the disadvantaged, and then blaming the disadvantaged for their disadvantages. Finally, from a retention standpoint, I would say we need to make sure that we're funding and supporting career development initiatives for our teachers of color, such as the National Board Certification process. Very proud of the state of North Carolina. We have a large number of National Board certified teachers here, but when you look at the demography of who's nationally board certified, 93% of our National Board certified teachers in the state of North Carolina are white. What can we do to diversify the National Board certified pool within the state? Because we know with that comes pay increase to your base salary. So these are some of the things that we need to think about from a recruitment and retention standpoint, particularly for our teachers of color.
Thank you so much. And I think that Kyle from the Hunt Institute linked the Drive Task Force final report in the chat. So thank you for that. There's so many great recommendations in there. Ricky, you're also a member of the task force. Would you like to share any additional thoughts?
Yeah, of course. Thank you. I'm mainly here on this question as a hype man for Dr. Graham, because he is doing such an incredible job of educating the public on what this report consists of and the recommendations that we're pushing forward as a task force. Just yesterday was our first true working day at the General Assembly. I had a meeting in the morning with other fellow legislators to discuss these recommendations and begin to talk about how we move some of these action items forward. I think that we're going to be continuing to have conversations around why representation matters, that it's not just a moral imperative, but an economic imperative to make sure that our students see themselves in our teachers, administrators, and leadership in our community. Just from a personal standpoint, I've been doing a lot of this work for the last few years, and I teach at the School of Education at UNC. And so I've had students on the first day of class come up to me with tears in their eyes because I'm the first Latino teacher that they've ever had, to say I've never had someone who understood me, who looked like me, who understood my experiences in history. And it just completely changed the dynamic in the classroom. I would also add that teacher diversity is not just of critical importance for our students of color, it's important for all students, right? Having a diverse classroom matters for everyone. And so we all learn from having a diverse classroom, not just in the student population, but in the people that are serving our students. And so I'm excited to continue to be in a position to push these conversations forward, because I think this is certainly a time to do it.
I was muted. Thank you so much, Ricky. Representative Hurtado, I'm sorry. I'm going to move on to the next question just because I want to make sure that we can cover everything. So this is a topic that has been in the news this week, and I think it's a very important one for us to discuss today. Our State Board of Education and the Department of Public Instruction have been working on revising the state social studies standards. And there's a lot of discussion about ensuring that our curriculum is culturally responsive and inclusive, and that it represents an accurate perspective on our history. So I'd like for you all to speak on why this is important for our students and what you all think the state, district, and educators should do to move towards a more culturally responsive and inclusive curriculum. So I'll start with Reagan.
Yes, thank you. So I think one aspect that could be changed, and this is even on the small level, is just changing our language when it comes to teaching history, rather than referring to it as slaves, refer to people who were enslaved, or talking about the homeless as people who are experiencing homeless. It's this little shift in language that it can seem small and trivial, but it does make a difference in the long run. And then also, while we're talking about changing curriculum to be more culturally responsive, I don't want it to be just limited to social studies and history. It's important to make sure that this finds its way in the environmental science classes, in the math classes, and in the English classes. I remember last year when I was taking AP Environmental Science, we had one small part about environmental racism, and that was just shoved in at the end of our studies. And even though that was at the end, we still didn't really learn about stuff that was happening currently in America, such as like the toxic air pollution in Chicago or lead poisoning in Los Angeles. It's important to teach students about what is happening in communities really next door to us. And in addition to that, I think it's important to put more Black authors and Black voices in our English curriculum. While everyone's trying to get involved in anti-racism reading outside of school, it's important to also have that in our school curriculum. And then following Amanda Gordon's amazing poetry at the inauguration, I saw this quote that says, "There's an Amanda Gorman at every high school that you may call underperforming or not worth the funding." So I think that also, while we're talking about being inclusive of all students, we need to put an urgency on honoring students' arts and students' voices, especially the voices of students of color who may be the next inaugural poet. We shouldn't shut down their dreams of doing something that may not seem conventional in the eyes of our current school curriculum. So I think that those are all really important to focus on.
Yes, I want to give you a standing ovation right now. That's so important. Thank you, Reagan. Ms. Murphy, I'll go to you next.
Yes, thank you so much. Reagan, I hope that you are going to be a teacher. Speaking of retention and keeping and recruiting, we need you, Reagan. So I think words matter. I think words absolutely matter. And I think that each of our students deserve, just like Mr. Hurtado said, to see themselves in not only as teachers, but in literature, like Reagan said, they deserve to see themselves represented. As a Participate Learning Global teacher, this fits perfectly into my views about global education and how we can use that to not only talk about American history, but world history as well. And we all know, I think we could all agree that our American history is very whitewashed, and that's exactly what we need to get away from. And by introducing these new social studies standards, and by watching our words, as Reagan said, and by being intentional with what we say and how it's written, that is how we move forward together. So the words matter. All the words that are being debated, they matter. And they matter to Reagan, and they matter to me, and they matter to our entire panel and all 500 plus people that are watching. So we have to stand up. We have to, just as several of our teachers, like the State Teacher of the Year, Maureen Stover, and Mariah Morris from last year, stood up yesterday and said, these words matter. This is what we would like to see in our social studies standards. So we have to fight that fight. We have to move forward. I'll give you one quick example. As a 7th and 8th grade social studies teacher, when I was in middle school, our middle school textbook, which was from, probably right when Reagan was born, it was written then, it had one paragraph, which was about half a page, talking about the Holocaust. That was the entirety of information on the Holocaust in my 7th and 8th grade textbook. And one of my students, who was very passionate about learning, not because it's an interesting thing that happened in history, not that it's wonderful that we need to talk about it that way, but that it's important to our history that we learn about events like that have happened. She was she wanted to write him a letter. She wanted to immediately start a campaign that, you can't learn everything that you need to know about that time in history and that specific event in one paragraph. So when we take important things like that and we either diminish them, make them smaller, less important seeming, we're doing such a disservice to our students, and we have to do better.
Thank you so much. And I just want to say that I think we're very lucky to have amazing students and educators who are speaking up on this issue. So I truly hope that our leaders will listen to you all. Dr. Graham and Representative Hurtado, I think you may want to speak on this as well. So I want to make sure you have that opportunity. Dr. Graham.
Yeah, thank you. Very quickly, I agree completely. Language matters. And what I'm hearing, unfortunately, are a lot of individuals who are having debates about concepts on which I believe they're ill-informed. We need to make sure that we're investing more time truly understanding what these concepts mean before we start having these debates. Secondly, I would argue that it's critically important that we operationalize terms. I think we're having people talk beyond one another, past one another, because they're using terms and those terms have not been defined in a consistent way so that we can discuss the concepts from the same point of reference. So it's critically important that we educate ourselves so that we can become more informed about what we mean relative to anti-racism, anti-bias, so on and so forth. The other thing that I want to point out in terms of the importance of culturally relevant pedagogy in our classrooms, it's critically important that all of our teachers, that's not our teachers of color. We tend to relegate this only to our teachers of color, but this is important for all of our teachers because it engages all of our students. Research shows us consistently that teachers who use culturally relevant pedagogy have higher rates of student engagement among all their students. Why? Representation matters. If I see myself, hear myself, learn about myself and the value that we bring to a context, then I'm going to be more engaged in the conversation. It's reflective of who I am and the experiences that I bring to bear. Gloria Ladson-Billings defines culturally relevant pedagogy using 3 tenets. Academic excellence, meaning that we intentionally focus on the attainment of discipline-specific content knowledge at a very high level so that you get to know the content information at an optimal level. Secondly, cultural competence, meaning a classroom teacher has taken the time to truly know who his or her students are, meaning that you spend time with students beyond the classroom and beyond the school, learning more about their cultural backgrounds, making strategic connections between your content and who your students are and what their aspirations are. And the most important tenet that we often overlook, critical consciousness, having the ability to take what you've learned in this content-specific course and now apply it to your community or to your society so that you can uplift what occurs in that society. So the educational experience becomes about us, not about me. Students of color are part of a collectivist identity. It's about us, So the more that I can connect what I'm learning to how I can improve us, then the more likely I will likely recall what I've learned in your classroom. So representation matters, uplifting the collective, and understanding that these experiences affirm my identity. This is why it's critically important to focus on culturally relevant pedagogy. But we first must acknowledge our history. We have to accept the truths of our history, and then we have to move forward in that history.
Yes, thank you so much.
Mhm.
Representative Hurtado, do you have anything to add to that?
Yeah, just very quickly. I mean, I think some great points were made. When we talk about representation in our classrooms, we often tie it to workforce sort of outcomes, which are incredibly important. Don't get me wrong, right? College access, are we placing them in jobs, et cetera. But one of the original purposes of our public education system was also as a cornerstone of our democracy. And at the moment, right, if you haven't noticed, our democracy is currently hanging on by a thread. And I think for us to really heal some of the breaches in our communities, we have to think about what does history and social studies mean for a community that is as diverse as it's ever been, and that will continue to be more diverse. And so I think that we need to have honest conversations and lean into that discomfort about what it means to collectively embrace this history that we have as a nation, and really move forward. Because I think learning about the tough battles fought and won in the past, and how we've come to where we are today makes us stronger. And I think that is the beauty of America. And I think that is the beauty of having these conversations. We've had tough conversations with the students that we work with every day. And it's made them even more proud to be a part of this nation, to lean into this experiment that we call democracy. And so I hope we continue having these conversations, because I think it's absolutely imperative that we do so.
Wow, I'm so glad that we're recording this conversation. I think that everybody in the state needs to watch what you all have said. This is so great. Thank you. So we're running out of time, not surprisingly, but we can't end this conversation without talking about Leandro. So we know that the parties to the Leandro case have agreed upon a fiscal year 2021 action plan, and that's been signed by Judge David Lee. So I'd love to hear, let's start with Representative Hurtado on how you expect to see the legislators address Leandro in the upcoming session.
Yeah, of course. I caught the tail end of the last conversation, and I've been a part of these conversations for the last few months, and I know that the conversation around broadband has certainly changed, right? We are certainly seeing that this is infrastructure that is no longer optional, right? We need to treat it as important as water and electricity at this point in our lives, because we need it to operate, whether it's your small business or your makeshift classroom at home. This is an important part of our lives, especially in rural North Carolina. And so I think getting that part right is critical. The other thing that I'm looking at when it comes to Leandro is the impact that the pandemic has had on our young children. And so really thinking more critically about early childhood education. Representative Clements announced yesterday on the floor that we'll be forming a early childhood caucus. And if she's listening, I hope to join that to continue pushing forward around what it means for our families to have that sort of support, and understanding that the years 0 through 5, 0 through 8 are so important and foundational for our future years, and a big part of Leandro. We've heard conversations around, it's tough to have a conversation around public education if we're not talking about our workforce. And if we're talking about a workforce that's been through as much as anyone else in the last year and a half, it's our teachers and all staff in our schools, quite frankly. And so how do we make sure that they're taken care of? How are we making sure that we're keeping them, that they're compensated to the level they need to, is certainly a conversation that we're all collectively having. And again, both Democrats and Republicans, the legislature, and Governor Cooper are really set on getting something done this year. And of course, I will never really lose an opportunity to plug teacher diversity. We just had that conversation, but again, it is very much a part of Leandro and how we move forward with our public education in the future. And so those are the sorts of conversations that I'm looking to have, that I'm having right now, and hopefully see some progress on this year.
Thank you so much. I'm glad that you brought in teacher diversity, and it's important to point out that almost all of the issues that we've talked about today are tied to Leandro. So unfortunately, we have to close now, but I want to give you each about 30 seconds to just give a closing statement about anything you'd like to talk about what you hope to see for this year or for the future in general. So let's start with Reagan.
Yes, thank you. So being a part of events and discussions like this just make me so excited for the future and what's to come for North Carolina. From policymakers and the education community, I hope to see a change in the way that students' mental health is valued in the schools, as well as what we talked about earlier with the change in the curriculum. I think that now is a better time than ever to make these changes, especially seeing as Black History Month begins in a few days. I know that me and other students are tired of watching the same movies in class that teachers pull out to talk about Black history. And rather than water down our Blackness, I hope that we move towards celebrating Black joy and creativity more in our school systems. So thank you for having me on this panel today.
Thank you so much. Ms. Murphy.
Yes, thank you. As a teacher, Reagan, I promise to do that for you and for my kids in my classroom. And that's really where Leandro hits me the hardest, is like in the face of each of my students every single day. One of my students, Phoebe Murphy, sent me a quote one year, and we were learning about sustainable development goals, and we were talking about changing the world and how are we going to make this the world that Reagan deserves and the world that my fourth graders deserve. How are we going to do that as teachers, as humans, as people? And so she sent me a quote that said, many little people in many little places do many little things, they can change the face of the world. It's an African proverb. It's on my email. If anyone has ever gotten an email from me, it's on there. I talk about it at every conference that I speak at. It's huge. And it resonates with me, not because of any other reason or all the reasons, but because she sent it to me and she felt like we were doing that in our classroom. And if every teacher can be that passionate and every student can show the world that they can make a change, just like Reagan's doing, just like your whole team, Reagan, just like Representative Hurtado, you're doing it, Mr. Graham, you're doing it, Lauren, by having these conversations in the forum, we are creating change. And if we can keep doing that, if we can keep moving forward, and if we can keep chipping away. I don't even think that that's an accurate term, because we should be like running towards Leandro case. We should be running full speed ahead, doing every single thing we can to make this not like a 5-year plan, but like a right now plan, like today. What are we going to do today to start working on this? So I hope that each of you will be that change, will be the light for the whole education community. So thank you, Lauren, for having us. It's been a great pleasure to be here.
Thank you so much. Ready to run. Dr. Graham.
Yeah, first I want to echo the words of Catherine Edmonds of what she said earlier. And I want us to remember that normal was abnormal for so many of our students of color and low income students. So I just want us to remember that. The other thing that I would say in my brief 30 seconds, specifically to our policymakers, I have 2 simple, concrete asks of you. Ask number 1, please read the Drive Task Force report and our recommendations, create sensible legislation around those recommendations, and fully fund those recommendations to ensure that our students across the state of North Carolina have access to highly qualified teachers of color in our low-income schools, our rural schools, and our urban schools. So that's number 1. Number 2, revisit our policies, our funding appropriations, and our accountability models that perpetuate school resegregation and creates a system that blames the disenfranchised for their disenfranchisement. If we do those 2 things, then we take a significant leap forward in the state of North Carolina. Thank you for having me today.
Thank you so much. And last but not least, Representative Hurtado.
Of course. Well, first, thank you so much for having me. I enjoyed this conversation and excited to continue working with all of you to push many of these issues forward. I'd say my overarching message is really to lead with urgency this year, right? There is relief that we need to work on immediately when it comes to federal dollars that will be coming to North Carolina soon, when we think about challenges we're facing immediately. But I also think about what it looks like to temper that urgency with patience. We have been through a lot. We continue to go through a lot. I heard a lot of talk on the previous conversation around the state of our mental health, what anxiety and isolation is doing to our kids, to our families, to us. And so I really want to think about what re-entry into life looks like. We historically have not done re-entry well in any issue, but really thinking about what it means to recover from this and come out stronger on the other side together. lastly, for me, I see hope on the horizon. I see students like Reagan, I see the students I work with every day, and know that as long as we continue to center students, families, and our community, that we can make progress on many of these issues. And so I'm excited to continue working with our younger generations to make sure that we are keeping our eye on the prize.
Totally agree. And I know I can speak for myself and say that I'm feeling incredibly inspired by all of you. We're so lucky to have you as leaders in our state. So thank you so much for joining us today.